The soil of the Tollense Valley in northeastern Germany does not yield its secrets through the steady, predictable progression of archaeological stratigraphy. Instead, it offers them in a violent, concentrated pulse. In 1996, an amateur archaeologist pulled a single humerus from the riverbank, a bone pierced by a flint arrowhead. It was the first clue to a Bronze Age cataclysm that should not, according to every established model of European prehistory, have existed. By the time the excavation reached its zenith, the valley had surrendered the remains of hundreds of young men, horses, and a terrifying array of blunt force weaponry. This was a professionalized, large-scale war occurring in 1200 BCE, involving thousands of combatants. Yet the most destabilizing discovery was not the scale of the slaughter, but the biological signature of the slain. For decades, the narrative of Central European identity was anchored in the concept of deep-rooted, indigenous continuity, the idea that the people who built the hill forts and tilled the Germanic plains were the direct, static ancestors of those who live there today. The Tollense discovery shattered this. When paleogeneticists sequenced the DNA from the marrow of the fallen, they found a population that was genetically distinct from the modern inhabitants of the region. The men who died in the mud of the Tollense were more closely related to modern Southern Europeans and Scandinavians than to the people currently living 50 miles from the battlefield. If the very foundation of regional identity is built upon the assumption of ancestral permanence, the genetic record of the Tollense Valley suggests that identity is not a monolith, but a fleeting snapshot of a restless, shifting genome. The traditional historical framework for Central Europe has long relied on the migration period of the 4th and 5th centuries CE, the Volkerwanderung, as the primary engine of demographic change. In this model, the collapse of the Roman frontier triggered a chaotic but ultimately traceable shuffle of Germanic tribes, the Goths, Vandals, and Saxons. It was a narrative of movement, yes, but one that assumed a certain ethnic coherence. It posited that these groups moved as intact biological units, eventually settling into the borders we recognize on a modern map. This perspective allowed for a comfortable, linear sense of heritage, where culture, language, and biology moved in a synchronized dance across the European stage. But academic consensus reinforced this by focusing on material culture. Pottery styles, burial rites, and linguistic evolution were treated as proxies for the people themselves. If the beaker pots changed or the corded wear patterns shifted, it was often interpreted as a change in fashion or a localized cultural exchange rather than a fundamental biological replacement. We viewed the past through the lens of the sedentary bias, the instinctive belief that humans, once they find fertile soil, tend to stay put. This created a mental map of Europe where populations were largely fixed, occasionally stirred by war or empire, but essentially continuous since the end of the last ice age. But the genetic record tells a more complex story. As the resolution of ancient DNA or aDNA sequencing improved, the image of a stable European heartland began to dissolve. We discovered that the people of the Tollense were not an isolated anomaly, but a symptom of a much larger, more volatile mechanism of human movement. The genetic data revealed that the Germanic identity was not a prehistoric inheritance, but a late-stage chemical reaction between three distinct, highly divergent ancestral populations that had been crashing into one another for millennia. To understand the scale of this miscalculation, one must look at the three primary ghosts haunting the modern European genome: the Western hunter-gatherers, the early European farmers, and the Yamnaya steppe pastoralists. For thousands of years, these groups lived in relative isolation, separated by geography and lifestyle. The hunter-gatherers held the forests. The farmers, migrating from the Near East, held the fertile loess soil. Then, roughly 4,800 years ago, a massive genetic pulse arrived from the Pontic-Caspian steppe. This was not a slow diffusion of ideas. It was a rapid, near-total demographic turnover. In parts of Central Europe, upwards of 75% of the local ancestry vanished within a few generations, replaced by the DNA of the steppe migrants. The arrival of the Yamnaya from the Pontic-Caspian steppe was not a mere shift in ceramic style. It was a biological pivot point that defines the modern European genome. This was a population that carried a distinct genetic signature. High frequencies of alleles associated with lactase persistence, increased stature, and a specific haplogroup, R1b, that would eventually dominate Western Europe. When their DNA collided with the existing Neolithic farmer populations in what is now Germany, the result was not a peaceful amalgamation, but a dramatic population bottleneck. The genetic data from burials following this arrival shows a sudden, sharp contraction of local male lineages. The Neolithic U chromosomes, which had been stable for thousands of years, were systematically replaced by those of the steppe migrants. This suggests a social structure built on extreme mobility and perhaps a warrior caste system. The Yamnaya brought with them the wheel, the domesticated horse, and a patrilineal social organization that favored the rapid expansion of a few successful male lineages. This is the mechanism of genetic drift on a continental scale. By 2500 BCE, the Beaker phenomenon, long thought to be a spread of fashion, was revealed by genomic sequencing to be a massive migration. In Britain, for example, 90% of the Neolithic gene pool was replaced by these migrants within a few centuries. In Germany, the turnover was equally profound, creating a population that was a high-tension hybrid of ancient forest dwellers, Anatolian farmers, and steppe pastoralists.
Yet even this triad of ancestors does not account for the volatility seen at the Tollense Valley. The men dying at the river were not a cross-section of a stable local tribe. Isotope analysis of their teeth, which records the chemical signature of the water they drank as children, revealed that many of the combatants had traveled hundreds of miles to reach the battlefield. They were a mobile, professionalized force, likely supported by a sophisticated logistical network that could feed and equip thousands of men far from their home territories. This challenges the tribal model of Bronze Age Europe, suggesting instead the existence of massive, trans-regional political entities that have left no written record. What the data revealed next recalibrated the timeline. While the Germanic identity is often projected into the deep past, the genetic evidence suggests that the specific clusters we associate with modern Northern and Central Europeans did not fully stabilize until much later than previously thought. The Tollense battlefield serves as a brutal reminder that the Bronze Age was a period of high genomic flux. There were ghost populations, groups that existed for centuries, fought wars, and built complex societies, whose genetic signatures were eventually diluted or overwritten by later movements. The Tollense warriors represent a lineage that was significant enough to field an army of thousands, yet their specific genetic cluster is largely absent from the modern local population. This reveals a fundamental law of evolutionary continuity. Cultural survival does not equal biological isolation. A group can adopt a language, a religion, or a social structure, while their underlying DNA is being quietly transformed by the arrival of migrants, traders, and invaders. The German genome is not a static inheritance from a singular ancient tribe. It is a ledger of every group that ever crossed the North European plain. The high frequency of Scandian or Southern markers in the Tollense dead suggests that the Bronze Age was perhaps more connected and more biologically volatile than the Iron Age that followed. This constant reshuffling is driven by the geography of the North European plain itself. Unlike the Mediterranean, which is fragmented by mountains and seas, the Great European Plain is a corridor. It is a biological highway stretching from the Urals to the Atlantic. This lack of physical barriers meant that any demographic pressure in the east, be it climate change, plague, or nomadic expansion,
rippled all the way to the Rhine and the Elbe. The genetic record shows that these pulses of migration were often accompanied by founder effects, where a small group of migrants would expand rapidly in a new territory, causing certain genetic traits to become dominant through sheer reproductive success, rather than any inherent survival of the fittest advantage. The myth of a pure or ancient bloodline in Central Europe is a misunderstanding of how recombination works. In every generation, the genetic cards are shuffled. Over centuries, the distinct signatures of the Yamnaya, or the Neolithic farmers, become fragmented and redistributed. Modern Germans are not descendants of any one of these groups in a linear sense. They are the cumulative result of their convergence. The darkest secret of the DNA record is not a hidden atrocity, but the realization that the concept of a native population is a temporal illusion. If one looks back 2,000 years, the population looks one way. Look back 4,000 and it is unrecognizable. The volatility of this genetic landscape is further complicated by a silent, microscopic traveler, Yersinia pestis. Long before the Black Death of the 14th century, the genetic record reveals that the plague was already stalking the North European plain. Ancient DNA extracted from the teeth of burials dating to 3000 BCE showed that the early migrants from the steppe were carrying an ancestral strain of the plague. This was not the flea-borne variant that would later decimate medieval cities, but a precursor that likely spread through close respiratory contact. Its impact, however, was no less catastrophic. The rapid disappearance of the Neolithic farmer populations, precisely as the steppe ancestry arrived, suggests that the conquest of Europe may have been paved by a biological vacuum. The darkest DNA secret is that the Germanic heartland was likely an empty stage, cleared by a pandemic, before it became a theater of war. This reveals the cold, statistical nature of survival. Evolution does not favor the pure, it favors the adaptable and the lucky. The survivors of these prehistoric bottlenecks were not necessarily the strongest warriors or the most advanced farmers. They were simply those whose immune systems could withstand the novel pathogens brought by the next wave of migrants. When we look at the modern German genome, we are looking at a filter. We see the alleles that survived the plague, the traits that endured the collapse of the Bronze Age, and the markers that persisted through the Roman Iron Age. The continuity we perceive is an optical illusion created by our short historical memory. Tollense Valley remains the most haunting evidence of this recalibration. It proves that by 1200 BCE, Northern Europe was already capable of generating a professional military class that transcended local kinship. These were men who lived, fought, and died as part of a trans-regional system that eventually broke. When that system collapsed, part of the broader Late Bronze Age collapse that took down the Mycenaeans and the Hittites, the people who moved into the vacuum were different. They brought new languages, new iron tools, and a different genetic blend. The German tribes that the Romans would eventually encounter, the Cimbri, the Teutons, the Suebi, were not the original inhabitants. They were merely the latest layer of sediment in a basin that had been filling and draining for 5 millennia.
Why do we cling to the myth of biological isolation? It is because our cultural systems, our laws, our borders, our sense of home require a foundation of permanence. We want to believe that the ground beneath our feet belongs to us because our ancestors' bones are buried in it. But genetics reveals that those bones often belong to people who would not recognize us as their kin. The Tollense warriors were German only by the geography of their death, not by the chemistry of their birth. This realization forces a disciplined reinterpretation of history. Identity is a narrative we overlay onto a biological reality that is characterized by constant, restless motion. This case study in the Tollense Valley
illustrates a universal evolutionary mechanism, the replacement cycle. Human populations are not stationary pools, they are rivers. Some branches dry up, others merge, and occasionally a flood from a distant mountain range changes the chemistry of the water entirely. The Germanic genome is a product of these floods. It is a record of the Yamnaya horsemen, the Anatolian tillers, the post-glacial hunters, and even the Roman legionnaires and Slavic migrants who would arrive later. Each group left a mark, but none owns the totality. The map of humanity wasn't written in a lab. It was carved by the sea and the stone. This is Helix Horizon, where we trace the code that refuses to stay still. If the Tollense Valley reveals that thousands could die in a war for a world that would eventually forget them, what does that imply for our own era of unprecedented global movement? We are currently living through a period of genetic recombination that mirrors the scale of the Yamnaya expansion, yet we lack the temporal distance to see the new clusters forming. If the Germanic identity was forged in the fire of the Bronze Age and the Plague, what biological architecture is being constructed in the silent, digital intersections of the 21st century?